Hi, good afternoon. My name is Shanique Slowly, and I will be presenting on integrating trauma treatment. Today, we'll be exploring what is trauma, what is PTSD, trauma and the brain, trauma and the memory, EMDR in the treatment of trauma, internal family system, what is it, and how is it useful in the treatment of trauma? Then we're going to look at Christian worldview as it's integrated with EMDR and internal family system. Then we will look at this writer's personal counseling theory. Before we can talk about the treatment of PTSD, we have to talk about what is trauma. So trauma is defined as a subjective experience that results in someone feeling overwhelmed, helpless, and disrupt the individual interpretation of the world and their environment. So it's a subjective experience that results from an incident or an experience that someone had that is not normal for them. Thus, they do not have the coping skills to cope with the event because that's an abnormal situation. It is not within their normal experience. It's not a normal experience for them to have. So it's considered an abnormal situation, thus not having enough coping skills to cope effectively with that experience. What are traumatic events? Traumatic events are witnessing or experiencing a terrorist attack, war or combat, rape, violent assault, natural disaster, or accidents. Understanding PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a debilitating psychiatric disorder that contributes to an individual experiencing functional impairment in various aspects of their lives. Now we are looking at the prevalence of PTSD. Researchers have discussed that 8%, yes, 8% of the general population have a lifetime prevalence of PTSD. The lifetime prevalence of PTSD among civilians, persons who are not in the service, ranges from 3.4% to 8%, while veterans, the prevalence of PTSD among veterans ranges from 7.7% to 13%. So, persons who are in service or veterans are at an increased risk of experiencing PTSD when compared to the civilian population. Research studies share that 78% of people will experience PTSD at some point in their life. PTSD is more common in people who have experienced multiple trauma. So persons who have experienced childhood trauma, for instance, are more likely to experience other form of trauma as they are more vulnerable to trauma triggers and experiencing trauma. First responders such as police officers, firefighters are at an increased risk of experiencing trauma as well due to the nature of their job. Police officers, those they're working in high risk environment that, you know, interacting with different persons, different environment, that increases their risk. Women are twice as likely as men to develop PTSD. Military veterans are at a higher risk of developing PTSD than the general population, as I have mentioned in the previous slide. About 1 in 3 survivors of sexual assault will develop PTSD. So 1/3 of survivors of sexual assault will develop PTSD. To be diagnosed with PTSD, a person must have witnessed or have experienced a traumatic event and have at least one re-experiencing symptoms, at least three avoidance symptoms, and at least two negative alteration in mood and cognition, and at least two hyperarousal symptoms for a minimum of 1 month. So a person also have to have experienced these symptoms for more than 30 days, 30 or more days, for it to be considered PTSD, along with, them experiencing functional impairment as well. PTSD symptoms includes flashback, nightmares, unwanted upsetting memory, emotional distress to traumatic reminder, physical reactivity um, to trauma reminders. So this is someone who might see someone who resembles their attacker and they become very emotional and they start sweating, they start shaking, they freeze. So these are some of the symptoms of PTSD. So this does not, fulfill all the symptoms, but these are some of the common symptoms of PTSD. Continuing trauma PTSD symptoms include trauma thoughts or feelings, trauma reminders, inability to recall key information of the trauma, negative thoughts and assumption about themselves or the world, exaggerated blame of self or others, decreased interest in activity, feelings of isolation or part are isolating, and difficulty experiencing positive emotions. So persons who experience PTSD might have heightened startle reaction. So these persons are easily startled. They are very hypervigilant, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping, which may be related to the nightmares and the trauma memories and the flashbacks. Irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior um, are some of the symptoms of PTSD. Risk factors for PTSD. Individuals with pre-existing mental illnesses, uh, individuals with lack of support, limited education, low social economic status, childhood adversities, and women are at an increased risk of experiencing PTSD. Functional impairment of PTSD. Individuals diagnosed with PTSD are at an increased risk of impairment in their, life areas like self-care, in their domestic life, interpersonal relationship, career, school, just to list a few. So trauma and the brain. So we are looking at the limbic system. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for attention. So people who have experienced trauma have difficulty focusing, and concentrating. So that part of the brain is impaired when exposed to trauma. The hippocampus, that is responsible for learning and memory, that also is impaired because memory is maladaptively stored when individuals experience trauma. And we'll look at this more when we go on to, the treatment of trauma. amygdala is responsible for emotional regulation and reactivity. Persons who have experienced trauma have difficulty regulating their emotions and thus, will need treatment for to learn coping skills, to process the trauma memory and need coping skills to regulate those emotions. So, so we are looking at a picture of a healthy brain versus, someone who is diagnosed with PTSD. And what we would see is that there there are structural abnormalities in individuals' brain who have PTSD when compared to individuals without PTSD. So we know that there's a lot of impairment, structural damage that has been done to the brain when people experience trauma. So it's not a little accident, it's not a little assault. It's not only affects the outside, and person's emotion, but it also affects the structure of the brain. So research study proposed that individuals with PTSD are more likely to have change in the volume of the gray matter area in the brain, right? And also share that individuals with reduced gray matter in the brain are at an increased risk of experiencing PTSD when compared to their counterpart um, with expected volume of gray matter. So when we come back to someone who is vulnerable, they are more likely to experience PTSD. So a person who previously experienced some form of trauma is more susceptible to experiencing trauma or more, when compared to someone who has not or someone who's not as vulnerable. So research studies have identified that people with PTSD are at an increased risk of, cognitive impairment, affect dysregulation, impairment in executive function, and developing, different. They're more likely developmental illnesses such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, bipolar, or psychosis. So persons with PTSD are more likely to have reduced quality of life. So, take note of that. So when we start discussing treatment, you will understand the importance of treatment for PTSD. Individual diagnosed with PTSD are at an increased risk of having intrusive memories. Intrusive memories contribute to the individual experiencing psychological arousal as if, they are experiencing the traumatic event in the present. Researchers, researchers believe that problems with trauma memory result from the maladaptive encoding, storage, and retrieval of those memories, right? Maladaptive information encoding may affect how trauma survivors interact with their environment as they actively look out for danger cues. So persons who, have experienced trauma or multiple traumas, they're very hypervigilant. They're always on high alert. They're always in survival mode. You know, they're stressing about an event that might, might not happen because it has happened in the past. So they're always on high alert. They're always, they believe that they're always in that danger zone. So they're always looking out for danger cue. Right. So impact of trauma memory. So people will have involuntary flashback. This is, they're doing something, they're sitting at their decks and they just have a flashback, and that can disrupt the entire day. Some persons might be able to recover sooner than others, and some others might have difficulty recovering from that flashback. Disorganized voluntary memory. Sometimes, they're unable to organize. Their brain is just, functioning as someone who has, an ADHD related symptoms, trouble recalling aspect of their daily life, sleep impairment. And, when you think of all these symptoms, it comes back down to reduced quality of life. A person with PTSD might have a reduced quality of life, or at an increased risk of having reduced quality of life. PTSD and memory. Memories of trauma can be triggered by trauma memory, reminders of the traumatic event, which may impact how individuals function in their environment, which can be, very uncomfortable, very demanding, very taxing on the body and the mind. Researchers propose that emotions associated with the psychological trauma alter the individual cognitive processing ability. So for instance, let's look at a child who has experienced trauma and is in class, and the teacher is teaching and they are unable to retain information, not because they're not smart, but because the trauma has altered their cognitive processing ability. Negative belief and PTSD. Researchers discuss that individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder are at an increased risk of having negative belief about themselves, others, and their environment. Unwarranted self-blame, guilt related to the trauma, poor self-image resulting from the trauma. You know, as persons who have experienced a car accident, all cars are bad. They will not want to drive in a car. They will believe that all cars results in accident. Someone would say, who have experienced a sexual abuse, mean I dress inappropriately and that's why I was assaulted. You know, I am ugly. I'm not good enough. Someone who has been sexually assaulted, I'm not good enough. I'm worthless. You know, so negative belief, having negative belief is not uncommon for persons who have experienced some sort of trauma or who has been diagnosed with PTSD. Research trauma treatment. So we are looking at treatment for trauma. Researchers share that treatment for mental health diagnoses such as PTSD should be a collaborative effort between the client and the counselor. Yes, the client needs to be involved in the treatment planning process. Clients come to treatment so they can be treated. It's not about the counselor, it's not about the clinician, it's about the client. The client is the person who is receiving the treatment, so should be involved in the planning and the implementation, should be an active participant in the planning and treatment process. All right, trauma treatment. Researchers discuss that early treatment intervention, along with a manualized treatment-focused psychotherapy such as EMDR, increases the likelihood of positive outcome. Researchers also discuss seeing a consistent reduction in PTSD symptoms when clients are exposed to manualized trauma treatment when compared to modalities that are not manualized. So EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Yes, so it does involve eye movement. So it is a manualized psychotherapy that integrates eye movement and other type of rhythmic stimulation vital in aiding individuals with PTSD in reprocessing maladaptive memory related to their trauma. So you'll find the clinician sitting in front of the client, you know, and using the index finger to move moving the index finger back and forth from so the client can follow the movement with their eyes. So that's where the eye movement stimulation comes in. Theory of EMDR. So EMDR treatment assumes that exposure to traumatic incident disturbs the brain natural neurological balance. EMDR assumes that traumatic information is frozen into place at the time of the traumatic event. EMDR believed that the original traumatic information, the image, the cognition, the affect, the physical sensation freeze the trauma memory into the original anxiety producing form. So someone who has experienced a trauma will will have the information related to the image, what they see, what they feel, what they hear. The physical sensation is frozen in time, and that's why when someone has a triggered or when someone is triggered, they have all these flashbacks where they have the same feeling, sensation, and same information about the trauma that comes back to memory, and that's why they feel as if they are experiencing a trauma as it did occur. EMDR theory proposed that due to the trauma being frozen in the anxiety producing form, trauma survivors cannot adequately process their trauma memory. So when they're triggered, the individual have PTSD symptoms such as flashback, nightmares, and intrusive thoughts, related to that traumatic experience. Right, let's look at the goal of EMDR. The goal of EMDR is to aid clients in developing a positive resolution to distressing traumatic memory, to process those frozen memory associated with the traumatic incidents, for clients to return to a place of calmness when processing their traumatic memory, and improve the quality of the client's life. Right, so phase one of EMDR. So we're looking at the phases of EMDR. As we said, it's a manualized treatment approach. So let's look at the phases. Phase one involves establishing the therapeutic relationship. Therapeutic relationship are essential to any treatment approach. Discuss treatment planning with the client. So phase one involves the clinician and the client working together to discuss how they go forward in the treatment process. So let's continue phase one. So the clinician will, it's called history taking, where the clinician will gather information about the clients, right? Identify and discuss with the client what memories and in which order the target memories will be processed. So this is very important. The clinician has no information about the client prior to, you know, the therapeutic relationship. So the clinician have to gather some information, about the client to ensure that, they can put a plan in place to ensure that the client will be successful in treatment. Phase 2 of EMDR, the clinician explains the EMDR process and address any concerns that the client may have. Phase 2 of the EMDR treatment focus on the preparation and stabilization of the client to determine if the client is ready to process trauma memory. And, I believe that this is one of the most important phase, of the treatment. Not to say the other phases are not important, but the stabilization phase of treatment is essential, as clients are unable, should not process trauma memory if they don't have the necessary tools that they need to cope with those distressing memories, related to the trauma. And, a lot of, clients will say, let's talk about it. And I'm like, let's look at those coping skills that you have. Let's ensure that you have enough so you can use these, when those distressing memory comes up, whether you're here or outside of here, you know. So I believe this is one of the most important part of the treatment approach, and that's just my personal perspective. EMDR phase 2 continue. The therapist explained the EMDR treatment model to the client. Clients are more likely to participate in something that they have some information about. So information is power, and giving the clients, clinicians explaining this treatment process to the client or the model to the client and the purpose behind the treatment model to the client will be, useful information so the client can feel comfortable in participating in this process. The clinician explain and demonstrate the bilateral stimulation, so they will ensure that the client is comfortable. They're able to see the finger, the clinician finger, the adjust seating position, identify and explain the stop signal if the client need to stop during processing, you know. So these are very important things that needs to get done before the reprocessing of the trauma memory begins. We continue looking at phase 2. During the phase 2 of treatment process, the clinician aid the client in identifying and learning resource and interventions to use as needed. So this will be used at any point during the treatment process, you know. And I like to think about the nurturing person intervention. And the nurturing person can be anyone. I remember in a video that I watched, in the class material, the nurturing person was a dog. And I think about my own nurturing person. And I think about, just being in the bosom of God, just being wrapped up, being protected, being shielded in that big, safe arms of God, and being comforted when I'm going through, challenging times, or even when I'm not going through challenging times. I think about, him being that nurturer. Safe place. That's another thing, the safe place. Where is that safe place? Where that you can go, that imaginary place for persons who, when you talk about integrating the Christian perspective, a safe place can be in church. A safe place can sit in Bible study, listening to persons who, believe that God is a healer. That could be a safe place. Growing up, my, safe place, and I didn't think about it then, but now I'm making some association. Safe place was, thinking about that golden gate where you will see, you'll meet God, and you will have those milk and honey, and you'll see those rainbows, and you see everything, that God, the mansion that God has prepared in heaven for us. So that might be a safe place, and we can't reduce the value of breathing exercise. Breathing exercises are very, essential, and all these interventions, you can take them wherever you go. I also value the containment. Some persons might not be ready to deal with some memories, and you know they can have those memories and they can create a container. They can put those memories in that container until they're ready to deal with it, you know, and I value that the client has power over that as well. All right. All right, so we are on phase 3 of EMDR. So phase 3 involved accessing the client target memory as it's currently being experienced. Take baseline measurement of the sensory component. So, what is being experienced as the client is talking about that memory. Using fast bilateral stimulation to activate the client inherent information processing system. So, the clinician is moving their finger back and forth to stimulate the neurons so they can connect and make association. The clinician checks with the clients to ensure that the process is moving. One of the things mentioned in the class resource is that the clinician might not have to check in, doesn't require the client to share what is going on, they just need to ensure that the process is moving. More of EMDR. Phase 4 focus on desensitization, where the clinician engage a client in bilateral stimulation while focusing on the traumatic event and continue until the client subjective disturbance unit is reduced to 0. So they're focusing on a target memory, and the clinicians use the bilateral stimulation, you know, and ensure it's reduced from 7 to 0. So, or whatever number the clients start with, rated their disturbance. So, for instance, if they rated it at a 5, a 5 out of 7, they continue until the subjective disturbance unit is reduced to 0 or 1 if appropriate. Phase 5 of EMDR is installation, begins after the sensitization phase has been completed. In this phase, the client associate and strengthen a positive belief with the target event until it feels entirely true. So a client might, the target, the negative cognition might be, I am useless. So the clinician may continue the bilateral stimulation until the client, feels that, I am indeed useful. I am useful. I'm not worthless. I am important. I'm useful. I have purpose. So, I do value all the parts, and this stands out as well for me, where when you think about those positive messages that the client is instilling, I think about the word of God that tells us that, we are made in his image. Now, if I'm useless, if I'm not worthy, and this, our creator, he is useful. He created the entire earth in how many days? 7 days. So we are indeed useful if we are created in his image. We can't be ugly if we are created in his image, you know. So when I think about these things, I think about how God is intentional with us. He created us all with a purpose, and we're useful, we're loved, we're thought of. They said he knows the amount of hairs on our head. I grew up hearing that little phase that he knows the amount. So we are needed, we are important, we belong, we are somebody, So I do value that installation of positive belief as it relates to phase 5 of the EMDR process. During phase 6 of EMDR process, the clinician conduct a body scan when the client is asked to hold in mind the target event and the positive belief while scanning the body from head to toe. So what we know about that trauma is that it comes along with body sensation. And sometimes our body holds on to that. So, the clinician is checking to see if, the body is still holding on to that. If that cognition brings across, those body, that physical sensation that resulted from the traumatic experience. We are at phase 7. During phase 7, the clinician aids the client in reprocessing and end with closure, in which a clinician assists the client in returning to a state of calm and in the present. All right. Phase 8 of EMDR process involved re-evaluating recently processed memory to ensure that the distress is still low and that positive cognition is still strong. During this phase, the client and the clinician identify the target and direction for continued treatment. So whether they're going to do a check-in every month, whether it's 2 months, whether they're going to go to bi-weekly, it comes back down to the client and the clinician, with the client being in charge of their treatment. So we are moving on to another interesting theory, the internal family system. The internal family system assumes that the human do not have a single personality, but multiple subpersonalities that function as a system. The internal family system consists of different parts, such as the self, the exile, the firefighter, and the manager. All right, so the internal family system. So we're looking at the self. The self embodies compassion, confidence, kindness, creativity, leadership, and characteristic leads to the individual to have a balanced and harmonious life. Right, so now we're going to look at the firefighter and the manager. The firefighter is a reactive part of the system that uses extreme method to ensure that the system is not overwhelmed. So, for instance, so if someone was abused as a child, physically or sexually, and to not, deal with those emotions, intense emotions, they might turn to drugs or alcohol, being extreme. So this is the part of the protective part that prevents, who wants to prevent the system from becoming overwhelmed. So they will use extreme method to ensure that they suppress these emotions. The managers now, they're protective, they're controlling part of the system that directly manage the reaction challenges to ensure success. So this one is always, is active daily to ensure that the system functions. And this part might be critical of you. Even though it's critical, it is still in a protective role. So internal family system, right? So as I said previously, it assumes that we have some personalities or parts, right, that becomes distinct entities and as a result of life experiences. So these are different parts of the self. These are different parts of the personalities. right? And each part represents a discrete mental system for experiencing and reacting to external situation. So like a trauma is an external situation. So, and none of the parts are bad and they all have a role to play. However, when we look at trauma disrupts the normal function of the internal family system, the internal system. Internal family system assume that each person have within them the ability to heal themselves. So we are looking at internal family system and trauma treatment. So this theory assumes that everybody has within them the ability to heal from their trauma, heal from anything that they're going through or have went through. When working with clients who have experienced trauma, clinician can aid the client in resolve negative perception by fostering mindfulness, self-compassion, and self-acceptance. Internal family system and trauma treatment continue. Internal family system utilizes mindfulness observation and connects with body sensation in order to increase the interoceptive awareness, increasing clients' ability to tolerate the intensity of feelings associated with the trauma. The clinician aids the client in reworking cognitive distortion resulting from the trauma in a non-confrontational and non-shaming manner. And with this, I can think about, how sometimes people who, experience trauma have these negative distortion about themselves, cognitive distortion, they don't believe that they're good enough, they're worthless, they don't belong, you know, those imposter syndrome. So this, we work in those cognition, you can help the client to identify that, they're good enough, they were created for a purpose. God, had a plan for them. His plan is, to prosper them and not to harm them, as we say, as is stated in Jeremiah. So the clients can learn to rework those cognition and develop positive cognition. And this is done in a non-confrontational and non-shaming manner. EMDR focus on aiding clients in reprocessing traumatic memories. Help them find ways to learn how to cope with those distressing memory. Learn those coping skills, such as containment, such as, those safe place, nurturing person, and develop a more positive belief about themselves and the world. Clients can build their support system with individuals of the same faith, by attending prayer meeting, church services, Bible studies, and other social gathering, you know. So a part of the treatment plan might be increase social support. And where do I find my social support? My social support might be at church if I'm a Christian, find one person to hug each day, find one person to hug each day, and that might be, that gentle touch that someone needs. And this is something that could be implemented in the treatment plan. Find someone that you could pray with. So, the clinician can integrate the Christian perspective into the treatment process as much as the client allows. So internal family system and Christian worldview. Internal family system view individuals as inherently spiritual beings. Internal family system assume that parts have spiritual traits that allow them to be seen in the light. Internal family system assume that individuals has an inner power that is available at any time to help them self-regulate. Family system treatment approach. The clinician can aid the client in learning the rules of the system, that have lost trust in the self. And we're talking about the self with the big S. Thus, learning to be more accepting of the internal system and understanding that God's plan is not to harm them, but to protect them and to give them peace. Personal counseling theory. This writer believes that clients should have the adequate coping skills before processing any trauma memory. Clients should be able to share as little or as much information about their trauma and still receive the benefit of the intervention. This writer also believes that reprocessing trauma memory and developing positive cognition is essential in the healing from trauma, thus improving the quality of life. This writer also believes that, we have subpersonalities and is, made up of system, and that the self-leadership will aid the part in functioning in harmony, thus improving the quality of life. And when I looked into the theory of internal family system, I thought about how many times I'm having a dialogue within me and not knowing the theory behind it. And this class have allowed me to, dig somewhat into this theory. And one of the things that I realized is that these are I selected these two theories due to curiosity. However, it gave me a different perspective on how to approach, to treat clients with trauma, and also that I need more training in order to practice these treatment approaches with clients. And that's something that I am looking forward to doing. Previously mentioned, this writer believes that EMDR and internal family system approaches are valuable tools that the writer can use in aiding trauma survivors in managing their symptoms, after she have received adequate training and supervision in those areas.